So content of the webinar today, obviously we're talking about empty homes. So we'll define what an empty home is to us in the context of our work, and then we'll introduce the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, which is the wider team within which the advice service, which Erin and I run, sits. We'll look at what the advice service does and who we help. Erin will then sort of go into specifically how we support neighbours and the things that neighbours can do when they're impacted by empty homes. We'll look at our neighbour toolkits, which are kind of some handy online resources available to people, which you can access on our website. We'll look at a couple of examples, and then the end will be a bit of a Q&A. All right then. So an empty home, for the purposes of our work, is a home that's been empty for 6 months or more and is liable for council tax. And in the most recent large-scale review of all the data in 2023, there are around 46,000 of these in Scotland. Sort of hesitate to be a bit more specific because there are a couple recording issues within a couple of councils where they used maybe slightly incorrect criteria to kind of categorize their empty homes, but it's around 46,000, and that number will be being made more concrete as soon as possible. I just want to apologise for this graphic. I tried to find a different one with larger wording, but it was the best I could do. And it's here just for a bit of an additional context, really. So it just shows a little bit of information on why these homes become empty in the first place, and why they tend to remain empty. A lot of it is around kind of an absence of an owner, whether that be because an owner died or they've purchased with a view to renovate, and then that's taking longer than they thought it might, or they, because they don't have the funds. But the important thing really is that whatever the reason, the symptoms of an empty home can really impact neighbours directly and wider communities, which is why we sort of do what we do. So yeah, what's being done about it? So in 2010, Scottish Government launched the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership. We're funded by the Scottish Government but hosted by Shelter Scotland, with kind of an overall goal of bringing long-term private sector empty homes back into use. And since 2010, since the beginning of that partnership, over 9,000 have been brought back into use. So I should say that the partnership was launched after a review of the private rented sector found that there are an enormous number of empty privately owned homes throughout the country, far more than was initially thought. And it was felt that at that time, these privately owned homes being brought back into use could tackle the housing shortages that were present at that time. And given we're now in a worsening housing crisis and more local authorities are declaring housing emergencies, empty homes work is as important as ever. So how have those 9,000 empty homes been brought back into use? The partnership has various arms. We have kind of a projects function where our projects manager, Andy, runs a variety of medium to large scale projects in partnership with charities, community organisations, local authorities, to look at creative ways of bringing homes back into use. And one of those, for example, is a partnership currently with Argyll and Bute Council, specifically the Health and Social Care Partnership and the housing team within the council, that's looking at how empty homes can be brought back into use quickly to address the lack of housing for key workers. Argyll and Bute are struggling to employ doctors and nurses and other key workers at the moment because no one will come to them from outside the area, because there's no guarantee of housing when they find a job. So they're looking at ways that people who apply for these jobs can be matched up with housing right away, and looking at how empty homes can be renovated quickly to be that necessary housing. we've got kind of a policy function, which over the years has worked to develop an empty homes kind of best practice and framework, which local authorities have gradually taken on to mainstream empty homes work. And currently we're sitting at 27 out of 32 local authorities which have now mainstreamed empty homes work, and the biggest part of that really is having dedicated empty homes officers, and Erin will touch on empty homes officers a little bit more later. And we continue to push for the remaining local authorities to mainstream empty homes work. We've got a partnerships function. Our partnerships manager is responsible for kind of training new empty homes officers, new people in the network, and kind of ensuring the provision of best practice throughout. And then we have Erin and I who run the Empty Homes Advice Service. So for all the work that kind of goes on in the background, we are the public face of the partnership. So anyone that calls the partnership, whether it's you or someone within your community who wants to speak about an issue relating to an empty home, it'll be us that you speak to. We provide free advice on phone and email, Monday to Friday, and we also have some online resources, blogs, interactive tools, and then our neighbour toolkits, which we'll look at a bit later. What's going on? Excuse me, I've frozen. So yeah, we provide advice to anyone really related to an empty home, whether that's an owner, a neighbour, a direct neighbour, or a community member, investors, and then also practitioners, kind of professionals within the network as well. An example may be an owner who's inherited a home that needs renovation work, and we can advise on, for example, VAT discounts that are available on renovation work and supplies for a home that's been open for over 2 years, and then further exemptions and discounts for one that's been empty, for over 10 years. And sometimes we get contacted by investors who've identified they've seen an empty home in their area, they're interested in purchasing it. We can speak with the empty homes officers at the local authority who could look at whether that might be a property where the owner is interested in selling. They can contact the owner, and if the owner might be interested in selling, they can facilitate contact between the two. That being said, our kind of largest cohort of contacts is actually neighbours and community members, and currently it's making up around 40% of all the calls that we receive. Excuse me. There's kind of a range of reasons that neighbours contact us. Sometimes it's just a neighbour or community member with kind of a general concern that they've seen an empty home in their town and they want to flag it, knowing that some work will be done in the background by a local authority or by us to try and bring it back into use. But more often we're contacted by a neighbour who's being directly impacted by an empty home and the symptoms of an empty home. And in an urban area, that may be, for example, damp in a flat now spreading and affecting an adjoining flat that's not being dealt with. And in a rural area, that might be kind of a derelict building, which is deteriorating increasingly and might be kind of affecting the appeal of an area to new people moving in, and might be affecting property prices. And in a worst case scenario, this can create a bit of a cycle whereby neighbours decide to move away and an area becomes increasingly uninhabited. I think now I'm going to hand over to Erin, who is going to talk a bit more about what we can do, what we can support people to do. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. So I'm Erin. I'm the Empty Homes Advisor. I also started pretty recently, actually the same day as Matt. So what I'm going to talk about is what's sort of the law on empty homes. So you might think that is it legal to have a home unoccupied and empty for a long period of time? The short answer to that is yes. There is actually no law in Scotland to stop a home being left unoccupied. We can understand that this is probably really frustrating for a lot of people, especially the neighbours of empty properties, and can lead to a lot of difficult problems. So I just wanted to quickly mention some of the things that can be done, even though there's no sort of specific law. So a lot of the legislation that can help with empty homes is around environmental protection. So the first thing to mention would be statutory nuisance. So that applies to things like damp, mold, water ingress. I should mention that I'm just going to that the threshold for a property to get statutory nuisance is quite high. So it is a case-by-case basis. Sort of as a general rule, if the property is detached, it wouldn't apply for statutory nuisance. But it's always something to consider. It's also designed to protect people and not properties. So if a property, an empty home, because of an issue such as damp or mold, is causing a health problem for the neighbour, then that's when that legislation could come into place. Another bit of legislation is the Prevention of Damage by Pests Act, which sort of refers to like rats and mice. So that gives local authorities the power to serve notices on owners when there's rats and mice in the property or in the garden, and force them to take action. And something else that I think is important to mention is the 200% council tax. You might already know about this, but if a property is empty for more than 6 months, then they're liable to pay 200% council tax. So that would be on top of the council tax that they're already paying if they're at another property. So we find that is quite an incentive for people to bring the properties back into use, as nobody wants to pay that much council tax. I will say every council does things differently, and there's a little bit of discretion as well. But it's just something to be aware of. So how can we at the Advice Service help neighbours? So I'd say the first and most important thing that we do is listen to neighbours that call in. It can be really difficult to live next to an empty property, and a lot of like complex issues can arise. And I think a lot of people that call in really just want someone to talk to and to be heard. And we are the best people to talk to about that, because we do understand and we know how difficult it can be and the different problems that can come from this. So we spend a lot of time listening. Once we can sort of understand what the main problems are that are affecting the neighbours, we can offer advice. So it could be on vandalism, damp, or it could also be about shared cost of repairs, because that is something that is quite a big issue for neighbours of empty homes, especially if they're attached properties. So in relation to that, we can also signpost. So we work a lot with an organisation called Under One Roof, and we can signpost people to them. They are an organisation that deals with communal repairs and tenements, and can advise on sort of the rights and responsibilities of shared repairs there. Another thing we do is send information on the neighbour toolkit. So I'll actually come on to that in the next slide. But that's just something on our website that's got a lot of information that can help neighbours. Another part of what we do is refer to the EHO, which is Empty Homes Officer, and they work for every local authority, so they can sometimes offer area-specific advice, because obviously we know every council in Scotland has different sort of ways of doing things. If there's no Empty Homes Officer in the area, we can just sort of refer directly to the local council and try and get any issues that are happening resolved. So the neighbour toolkits, they can be found on our website using this link. So I'm not sure if you can see my mouse moving. So we've got 5 guides, and each one sort of goes over a different sort of issue. So the first one here is just sort of discusses what to do, sort of general, if the house next door is empty. It does explain a little bit about why a property is left empty, as I think a lot of people don't understand the reasons why, so it's always good to be like quite informed. The next one is about disrepair, so it's about repairs or damage to like roofs, guttering, but also could be about like overgrown gardens, because that can be quite an issue. So these guides go sort of step by step through all the different options. So for environmental health, that is things like damp and vermin, and it sort of explains in detail what steps the neighbour can take, what steps the council can take, and other steps from that. Antisocial behaviour covers all sorts of antisocial behaviour, vandalism, people breaking into the empty properties, and people like squatting in empty properties, things like that. And then the last one here is about sharing your story of living next to an empty home. We know that it's really difficult to live next to an empty home, and we want to make people more aware of the problems that empty homes can cause. So that's information about how neighbours can share their story with us, and we can try and publicise that, use that in our marketing materials, use that when we're discussing things, but also what steps they can take further. So for example, contacting their local councillor, contacting their MP, things like that. So these are all accessible on our website, and we can also send a link after as well, so it's easier to access. Now we'll go into a few case studies. So this is quite a nice one because it resolved really well. So we had a woman call in that was living next door to an empty property. It'd been empty for about 6 months, and there hadn't been much issue living next to an empty property at that time. But then all of a sudden, the neighbour of the empty property realised that squirrels had gotten into the empty property, and not only had they gotten into that property, they'd got into her property as well. So obviously, this is not an ideal situation for anyone. One of the first things that we mention in the neighbour guides is to try and contact the owner just to kind of resolve things. But in this situation, the owner lived in a different part of Scotland and wasn't responding to contact attempts. So feeling a bit frustrated, this woman called into us. And we were able to then, first of all, listen and sort of explain that we understood and went through the steps of what we were going to do. Then we referred the case over to the Empty Homes officer. So they were able to check the council tax records for the empty property and get the up-to-date information for the owner, and then made contact with them. And that way the situation was able to be resolved. So they, with permission, she passed on the owner's details to the neighbour, and they were able to make contact and resolve this problem. So without us or the Empty Homes officer, the owner wouldn't have been aware that there was any problems with the empty homes. So everything was able to get resolved. The squirrels moved out. We've got another similar one. A neighbour called in. They were living next door to an empty property. This time they didn't know how long the property had been empty, but they hadn't seen anyone there for a long time. The empty property, they believed, had a lot of damp and mold, and that damp and mold was sort of seeping in to the next door property, which was causing a lot of issues for the person who called in. They'd mentioned that they tried everything to get rid of the damp, but because it was coming from the next door property, there wasn't that much that they could do. In this instance, they were actually in one of the areas that didn't have an Empty Homes officer, so there was a little bit less that we could do, or we couldn't refer to them. So instead what we did when they called in was the same. We went through the toolkit and discussed the different options. Based on the circumstances, we felt that a report to environmental health would actually be the best solution. So I helped the neighbour to report this issue to environmental health. Environmental health came out, assessed the damp, and was able to issue a warrant to the owner of the empty property to get the issue sorted. So in both these situations, it was a positive outcome that we managed to get. And I've just got, I think this is our last slide, but it's just because we've mentioned Empty Homes officers quite a lot, I just wanted to go in a little bit more detail about who they are and what they do. So as Matt mentioned, there's out of the 32 local authorities in Scotland, 27 of them have a dedicated Empty Homes officer. So this is someone that has dedicated either their whole role or part of their role to working on empty homes to bring them back into use. So ideally, one day we'd love that number to be 32 out of 32. But yeah, 27 is a really good number. They're invaluable to us. One of the most important things that they can do is, because they're part of the local authority, is they can search the council tax records and find out the information of the owner of the property. So they can get the name and the contact details. And they, once they know who the owner is, they try and work with the owner to bring the property back into use. So as Matt mentioned, there's a lot of reasons why a property could become empty, and we found a lot of people could become quite overwhelmed and just need a bit of support. So that's where the Empty Homes Officer can step in, as well as us at the Advice Service, to offer some support and advice on what to do with their empty property. So the Empty Homes Officer, they can do this in quite a few different ways, like contact them by phone or email. They can also go out to the property to see how it looks. If it looks empty, that sort of thing, they can put a card through the door. So they're really, really useful to us. And oh, sorry, go back a bit. And here at the bottom is just a link to how you can get their contact details. So you can contact us directly at the Advice Service, but you can also contact the Empty Homes Officers directly, and their information is just down there. These pictures here are actually two of the Empty Homes Officers. So we've got the Western Isles and the Highlands. For the 5 local authorities that don't have an Empty Homes Officer, we can still try to help, and we definitely do try to help, but it can just take a little bit longer because we don't have that access to council tax records, and we don't have the sort of local specific advice that the Empty Homes Officers can offer. So I do believe that's the end of the presentation. So I just want to say thank you for listening. We can definitely send out these slides, which has our information, the slide information and our information if you want to contact us. And now I think it's time for questions and answers. I have, apologies, I did mute everyone earlier, just because there's a little bit of background noise. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. And I'll just stop sharing now.